Somewhere within the documented archives of Mississippi's antebellum history lies a case so disturbing that 3 separate county clerks refused to transcribe the full testimonies. 9 plantation owners, all men of considerable wealth and social standing, found themselves subjected to the very practice they had forced upon hundreds of enslaved people. Controlled breeding, meticulously scheduled and clinically documented. The person who orchestrated this reversal was, on paper, Property himself, a slave named Moses Jackson, whose intelligence and patience turned a system of cruelty back onto the men who had built it. What survives in the historical record, scattered through fragments that were deliberately obscured, is not a tale of supernatural vengeance. Instead, it is something far more unsettling, a slow, methodical campaign of psychological warfare carried out by someone the law refused to recognize as fully human. Before we continue with the story of Moses Jackson and the plantation owners who came to fear their own practices, if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and tap that notification bell. We uncover the darkest corners of American history, the ones textbooks refuse to touch. And let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. We love seeing where our audience discovers the forgotten stories. To understand how a man in chains could bring 9 masters to their knees, we first have to understand the world that shaped Moses Jackson and the brutal efficiency of the system he would eventually turn against itself. The Yazoo Delta region of Mississippi in 1842 represented the height of what plantation owners proudly called scientific agriculture, a cold euphemism for the systematic exploitation of human beings to maximize cotton production. Here, where the rich alluvial soil could make a man wealthy in a single growing season, 9 neighboring plantations formed an informal consortium. Their owners met monthly to discuss crop prices, pest control, and what they refer to as stock management, the buying, selling, and breeding of enslaved people. These 9 men, Silas Rutledge, Bartholomew Crenshaw, Josiah Pryor, Nathaniel Pendergast, Cyrus Whitfield, Augustus Fairchild, Cornelius Vance, Thaddeus Beaumont, and Edmund Halsey, controlled nearly 2,000 acres and more than 400 enslaved people between them. They were not the stereotypical whip-wielding overseers of popular imagination, but rather educated, calculated men who viewed slavery as a business enterprise. They attended the same church, sat on the same civic boards, and sent their children to the same private academy in Vicksburg. What made their consortium unusual, even among other slaveholders, was the clinical nature of their breeding program. Forced breeding existed throughout the South, but these 9 men approached it with an almost scientific precision that disturbed even fellow plantation owners. They kept detailed ledgers documenting not just births and deaths, but bloodlines, physical traits, perceived intelligence, and what they coldly labeled temperamental suitability. They loaned enslaved men and women to one another for breeding, treating human reproduction as though they were managing the improvement of livestock. Into this world, in the spring of 1823, a woman named Esther was sold to Silas Rutledge's Willow Creek plantation. She was 23, literate, though she carefully hid this dangerous skill, and 5 months pregnant. The child's father had been sold away months earlier, a common tactic meant to prevent emotional bonds that might inspire resistance. Esther gave birth to a boy in August that year, and because Rutledge had recently acquired a valuable horse named Moses, he gave the child the same name, the way one might name 2 dogs from the same litter. Moses Jackson grew up with a sharp clarity that comes from witnessing horror every day. He understood exactly how the system that owned him operated. At 7, he watched his mother be loaned out to Crenshaw's plantation, returning 3 months later with a distant, haunted look that never left her. He observed the quarterly meetings where the 9 owners gathered at Rutledge's manor, discussing their human property over brandy and cigars. And through careful observation and his mother's secret reading lessons, taught by candlelight in their cabin, Moses learned not only to read words, but to read people. By the time he was 16, his intelligence could no longer be hidden. Rutledge, instead of seeing it as a threat, saw it as an asset. Smart enslaved people, if properly controlled, could be extremely useful. They could serve as drivers, oversee others, or manage complex tasks that freed white overseers for other duties. Moses was assigned to the plantation's record-keeping office, a small building near the main house where ledgers tracked every aspect of the operation. It was there, copying columns of names and figures into fresh books, that he saw the full scope of the breeding program. The clinical language did nothing to soften the horror. Productive pairing, Sarah, 23, to Augustus, 27. Anticipated yield in 9 months. Poor outcome, Julia, 19, miscarried. Reassigned to field labor. The 9 owners traded enslaved people like playing cards, arranging forced unions based solely on projected genetic outcomes and economic value. Moses said nothing. He kept his face neutral, his handwriting perfect, and his demeanor obedient. But behind his eyes, something cold and deliberate was taking shape. The event that would eventually trigger everything did not begin with Moses. It began with his mother. In March 1841, Esther was assigned to what the ledgers clinically described as breeding rotation with a man from Beaumont's plantation. She was 38 by then, considered past her prime breeding years, but consortium was experimenting with what they called extended productive years. The man assigned to her, a 19-year-old field hand named Samuel, was barely more than a boy. Esther refused. Refusal in this system was not just disobedience. It was something the owners had never accounted for. It simply wasn't supposed to happen. The reaction was swift and public. Esther was whipped, 30 lashes, in front of all the enslaved people on the Rutledge plantation, a demonstration of what happened when property forgot its place. Moses, now 18, was forced to watch. The overseers made sure of it, grabbing his. They held his head, so he couldn't look away. Esther survived the whipping, but something inside her broke. 3 weeks later, she walked into the Yazoo River and never returned. The official record listed it as an accidental drowning. Moses, copying the death entry into the ledger in his flawless handwriting, said nothing. His expression didn't change. His hand didn't tremble. But when Rutledge looked at him, searching for any sign of grief that might affect his work, something in Moses's eyes made the plantation owner uncomfortable enough to turn away first. It should have been a warning. For months after his mother's death, Moses made a request that stunned everyone. He asked permission to marry. The woman was named Rachel, and she belonged to Cyrus Whitfield's plantation. She was 21, strong and intelligent in the careful, quiet way enslaved women learned to hide. Moses had met her during one of the consortium's quarterly gatherings, where enslaved people from all 9 plantations were brought together, so the owners could evaluate possible breeding pairs. Rutledge, pleased that his educated slave appeared to be embracing the very system he served, granted permission. It aligned perfectly with the consortium's plans. A union between 2 strong, intelligent individuals might produce highly valuable children. Papers were prepared. Rachel was temporarily transferred to Willow Creek. A small ceremony was permitted. The kind of wedding enslaved people were allowed, symbolic but without any legal meaning, just enough ritual to satisfy what the owners imagined was their need for civilized behavior. What none of the 9 owners understood was that they had just given Moses Jackson access to every plantation in their consortium. Now he had a wife who could be, and regularly was, loaned out for breeding rotations to the other estates. And because Moses had made himself indispensable in record-keeping, he was often sent to update ledgers on those same plantations, carrying correspondence, delivering breeding schedules, and managing assignment changes. For 2 years, Moses played his role flawlessly. He was the ideal version of what these men wanted to believe about slavery. An intelligent black man who supposedly accepted the natural order, served efficiently, and asked for nothing beyond the tiny privileges of a trusted servant. He learned the layout of every plantation. He memorized every schedule, every routine, every security measure. He discovered which overseers drank, which ones gambled, which could be bribed, and which made secret visits to the slave quarters at night for reasons they never confessed to their wives. And he learned something even more valuable. The owners' greatest weakness was their absolute belief in the permanence of their system. They had built a structure so total, so complete in its control, that they simply could not imagine it ever being used against them. The reversal began on a suffocating July night in 1843, when Bartholomew Crenshaw vanished from his own bedroom. His wife found the empty bed at dawn, the sheets untouched. A massive search began immediately. Every enslaved person on every plantation was accounted for and interrogated. Moses, who had been working late on ledgers in Rutledge's office, was questioned briefly and dismissed. Multiple people had seen him throughout the night. Crenshaw was found 3 days later, 15 miles away, in an abandoned overseer's cabin on the edge of Vance's property. He was alive and physically unharmed, but profoundly shaken. His account, offered in broken fragments to the sheriff and the other consortium members, was almost incoherent. He claimed he had been drugged. His evening brandy had tasted slightly unusual. He remembered nothing until waking the cabin chained to a bed. What happened during those 3 days would only become clear later as the other owners began to disappear. The disappearances followed a pattern that only made sense in hindsight. Each of the 9 owners vanished from his own home, always at night, each time with the same calculated precision. Josiah Pryor disappeared exactly 2 weeks after Crenshaw was found, then Nathaniel Pendergast, then Cyrus Whitfield. The intervals were irregular enough to prevent prediction, but regular enough to create rising terror. Local authorities were baffled. These weren't typical kidnappings. No ransom demands came. No political motive could be found. Each man turned up after 3 to 5 days, always in abandoned buildings at the outer edges of Consortium's lands, always chained, always physically untouched, and always psychologically shattered. Every one of them initially refused to talk about what had happened during their captivity. The Consortium's quarterly meeting, scheduled for October 1843, was held under extraordinary circumstances. 5 of the 9 owners had now experienced abduction. Armed guards patrolled the grounds of Rutledge's manor. The remaining 4 men, Rutledge, Augustus Fairchild, Cornelius Vance, and Thaddeus Beaumont, demanded answers from their shaken colleagues. It was Pryor who finally broke. His hands trembled as he accepted a glass of whiskey. What he described chilled the room more than the autumn air outside. During his captivity, Pryor said he had been visited daily by a masked figure who never spoke but left behind documents, copies of Consortium's own breeding ledgers. But these copies had been altered, transformed, where the original ledgers listed enslaved people by name, age, and breeding value. These new versions listed the 9 plantation owners themselves, complete with clinical but fabricated details. Josiah Pryor, 48, strong constitution, demonstrated fertility, 6 legitimate children, suitable for breeding program, recommended pairing schedule, daily rotation with females from target demographic, goal, 100 conceptions over 24-month period. It was the specificity that made it horrifying. Each owner's entry included details about his own family, his own children, his own physical traits, all written in the same cold, dehumanizing terminology they had used for 2 decades. The documents were professionally prepared, copied in flawless script, the kind of script Moses Jackson was known for. But Moses couldn't be responsible. He had been accounted for during every disappearance, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence each night. He had been in Rutledge's office during Crenshaw's abduction. He had been at Beaumont's plantation, updating their quarterly records when Pryor vanished. The investigations, such as they were, cleared Moses immediately. After all, he was property. How could property orchestrate something this complex, this precise? What the owners didn't yet realize was that Moses had never been acting alone. He had spent 2 years quietly building a network made possible by the very structure of Consortium itself. The monthly breeding rotations, the loaning of enslaved people between plantations, the constant movement of servants and field hands for various tasks. All of it gave Moses a perfect cover to identify and carefully recruit those who shared his intelligence, his patience, and his desire for something far greater than escape. There was Rachel, his wife, whose forced transfers between plantations made her an invisible courier. There was Daniel, a blacksmith at Fairchild Plantation, who could forge chains and locks. There was Grace, a house servant at Vance's estate, who had access to laudanum from a medicine cabinet and knew exactly which beverages each owner preferred. There was Isaac, a driver on Pendergast Plantation, who could move through the night under the pretext of checking livestock. There were a dozen others, each playing a small role, each with flawless alibis, each invisible in a way enslaved people were always invisible to their owners, present but unseen, human but never acknowledged. The abductions continued. Edmund Halsey disappeared in November. The pattern was becoming unmistakable, even if it remained unstoppable. Each owner vanished, endured whatever happened during those days of captivity, and returned changed, quieter, jumpier, constantly checking shadows. What the community whispered, what the newspapers in Vicksburg reported with cautious ambiguity, was not simply the disappearances themselves, but the strange behavior of the victims afterward. Bartholomew Crenshaw, once notorious for his fervent enthusiasm in the breeding program, abruptly ordered it halted on his plantation. He refused to explain. When the other consortium members pressed him, he said only, "You'll understand when it's your turn." The phrase, "when it's your turn," began to haunt the remaining owners. By now it was painfully clear this wasn't random violence, nor was it revenge in the ordinary sense. This was systematic, personal, and it was building towards something. In December 1843, during what would become Consortium's final quarterly meeting, Augustus Fairchild made a desperate proposal. They should free all their enslaved people immediately, dissolve the Consortium, and leave Mississippi forever. The others stared at him as if he'd gone mad. Silas Rutledge, who had not yet been taken, laughed aloud. "We own over 400 people worth of collective fortune," Rutledge said. "You want us to throw it all away because someone's playing pranks on us?" "These aren't pranks," Fairchild answered, his voice tight. "What they're doing to us during those days, it's the program. Our program. They're applying it to us." Silence swept the room. Everyone understood exactly what he meant, but none dared say out loud. Before anyone could respond, Moses Jackson entered. Carrying updated ledgers from Fairchild's plantation, he moved with his characteristic quiet precision, placing the books on the table, nodding respectfully, preparing to leave. "Moses," Rutledge said sharply, "you hear things, moving between plantations like you do. Any word about who might be behind these incidents?" Moses turned back, his face blank and polite. "No, sir, though I did hear something strange from one of Mr. Crenshaw's field hands." "What?" Rutledge demanded. He said, "Mr. Crenshaw's been having nightmares. Wakes up screaming about schedules and rotations." Moses paused, as if unsure whether he should go on. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that's the same language in the breeding ledgers, isn't it? Schedules and rotations." The room turned ice cold. Moses had said nothing disrespectful, nothing that could be labeled insolence. He had merely made an observation, the kind of thing an intelligent servant might remark upon. But something in the way he stood there, patiently waiting for dismissal, made every man in that room profoundly uneasy. "Get out," Rutledge said quietly. Moses left, but the seed had already taken root, because now every man in that room was thinking about what Fairchild had implied and what Crenshaw's nightmare suggested. During captivity, something was being done to these men, something that mirrored exactly the system they had built. The truth emerged slowly over the next weeks, as more owners were taken and returned, as their refusal to speak crumbled under the weight of shared trauma. What they finally admitted, first to one another, and later in careful, half-censored testimony that 3 county clerks refused to fully transcribe, was this: during captivity, each man was subjected to a precise, intentional reversal of the breeding program. They were visited daily by enslaved women from their own plantations or from the estates of their fellow owners, women they themselves had once assigned to breeding rotations. These women didn't harm them. They didn't have to. They simply arrived on schedule, exactly as outlined in the annotated ledgers. The owners were chained, yes, but they were fed well, kept clean, and handled with a cold, clinical efficiency. And each day, they were presented with the same choice they had forced upon enslaved people for years: follow the breeding schedule or face unnamed consequences. The consequences were never stated. They didn't need to be. The psychological weight of absolute powerlessness, of being reduced to a biological instrument for someone else's purpose, was punishment enough. No breeding occurred. The women made that clear through subtle signals. This wasn't about creating children. This was about forcing these men to feel, in their own bodies and minds, exactly what it meant to be reduced to reproductive potential, to have their humanity stripped and replaced with function. By February 1844, 7 of the 9 owners had undergone the reversal. Only Silas Rutledge and Thaddeus Beaumont remained. Terror in the region had reached a fever pitch. The local sheriff, himself a small slaveholder, had no framework for understanding what was happening. This wasn't rebellion in any traditional sense. No property had been destroyed. No violence committed. No one had tried to escape. And yet, social order was collapsing from within. The 7 men who had been taken were changed. Some had sold their slaves and fled the region entirely. Others freed a small number of enslaved people. Not all, because that would have destroyed them financially, but enough to resemble some kind of penance. Bartholomew Crenshaw had fallen ill with what his doctor called nervous exhaustion and barely left his bedroom. Josiah Pryor had become an outspoken advocate for gradual emancipation, a position that turned him into a pariah among his former peers. The consortium was dead. The breeding program was finished. But Moses Jackson's campaign was not, because 2 men still remained, the men who had created the system itself. Its architect, Silas Rutledge, and its most enthusiastic enforcer, Thaddeus Beaumont. Rutledge, to his credit, understood what was happening better than the others ever had. He recognized the systematic planning behind the reversals, the intelligence required, the precision, and he began to suspect Moses, not because of evidence, but because he had watched Moses for years and was finally beginning to understand what he had truly seen. Not obedience, patience. On March 3rd, 1844, Rutledge summoned Moses to his study. It was evening. The house was quiet. His wife was visiting relatives in Natchez. Rutledge sat behind his polished mahogany desk, while Moses stood before him. The posture of servant before master maintained even now. "I know it's you," Rutledge said quietly. Moses's face remained perfectly still. "Sir, this whole business, the disappearances, the program, it's too perfect, too exact. It takes someone who understands how we think, how we operate, someone with access to our records, our schedules, our homes." Rutledge leaned forward. "It takes someone who could forge my handwriting well enough to create false documents. Someone exactly like you." "That's a serious accusation, sir," Moses replied calmly. "What evidence do you have?" "None. And that's the brilliance of it." Rutledge gave a humorless smile. "You built everything on movement the consortium itself created, using our system against us." He exhaled slowly. "I want to make you an offer." Moses waited. "Stop this now. The breeding program is already finished. The consortium is dissolved. You've won. In exchange, I'll grant you and Rachel freedom. Legal freedom. Documented. You can go north, start a life. I'll even provide travel funds." Moses said nothing for a long moment. Then, "And the others? The 400 people you and your friends still own." "I can't free them all," Rutledge said sharply. "I'd lose everything." "Yes," Moses said softly, "you would." Something in his tone made Rutledge's hand drift toward the pistol he had placed in the desk drawer before calling this meeting. But Moses didn't move. He made no threat. He simply stood there, looking at the man who legally owned him, the man who had watched him grow up, worked him like machinery, and never once seen him as human. You think I'm the architect of this? Moses asked, you think I could organize something this complex while being watched constantly? While having no resources, no freedom of movement, no legal stand to speak in court if I were accused. Then who? Rutledge whispered. You created this, Mr. Rutledge. Every part of it. Your breeding program, your ledgers, your systematic dehumanization. You built the machinery. Someone simply learned to operate it. Moses turned toward the door. As for your offer, I'll consider it. But you still don't understand. This isn't about me winning. This is about you learning. He left before Rutledge could respond, before panic or pride could turn the moment violent. And Rutledge, sitting alone in his study with the unused pistol in his drawer, felt something he had never experienced in his own home. Fear. 2 weeks later, Silas Rutledge disappeared from his bedroom. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, the horror in the Yazoo Delta intensified. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's uncover what happened next. Rutledge was found after 6 days, the longest captivity of any of the owners. He was discovered inside the old record-keeping building on his own plantation, the very structure where Moses had spent years copying breeding ledgers. When the sheriff and several armed men broke down the door, they found Rutledge chained to a desk, surrounded by towering stacks of documents. These were not the annotated ledgers described by the other owners. These were far more extensive. A complete documentation of the consortium's breeding program from the very beginning, copied with meticulous detail. Every forced pairing, every child produced, every family torn apart, every woman who miscarried under the weight of abuse, every man sold away from his children. 20 years of treating human beings as livestock, all laid out in perfect order. But what made the documents truly devastating was the addition Rutledge discovered once he was coherent enough to read them. Next to each entry about an enslaved person, someone had written a corresponding detail about Rutledge's own family. Next to the record of an enslaved woman's forced pregnancy, a note about Rutledge's wife's pregnancies. Next to the sale of an enslaved child, a note about where Rutledge's own children went to school. The parallels were impossible to escape. Horrifying, precise. Here is what you did to others, and here is what it would feel like if it were done to you. The sheriff, William Cortland, who had known Rutledge for 15 years, later testified in a private deposition that what disturbed him most was not Rutledge's physical state. He was thin, dehydrated, but medically stable. It was his mind that had fractured. Rutledge kept repeating phrases from the ledgers, mixing them with fragments of personal memories. Sarah, age 17, paired with Thomas, age 24. My daughter Elizabeth is 17 now. Productive outcome expected within 9 months. Elizabeth attended her first cotillion in December. The documents surrounding Rutledge included something else, something that would only be understood later. Detailed schedules, showing which enslaved people had been assigned to visit him during his captivity. These schedules mimicked exactly the breeding rotation schedules Rutledge himself had designed, but instead of sexual encounters, the schedules indicated something very different. Monday, March 4th, 2 p.m. Clara, age 19, product of 1825 pairing between Esther and Samuel. Reading session, Ledger Volume 3, pages 47 to 52. Clara was Moses Jackson's half-sister, born from one of the forced pairings his mother Esther had endured before her death. Reading those ledger pages to Rutledge meant reading aloud the clinical documentation of her own conception, the reduction of her parents to breeding stock, the calculation of her value based on her mother's previous productive outcomes. When Rutledge was finally able to speak coherently 3 days after being found, he gave testimony to Sheriff Cortland that revealed a picture of carefully engineered psychological dismantling. On the first day of his captivity, he said he had been left alone with documents, forced to read his own handwriting documenting 20 years of human trafficking and forced reproduction. The clinical language he had once praised for its efficiency and clarity became unbearable when he was forced to read it slowly, deliberately, understanding for the first time what each entry truly meant. On the second day, the visits began. Young men and women, all born from the consortium's breeding program, came in shifts. They didn't speak to him directly. They simply sat across the desk from him, exactly as he had once sat across from buyers when selling their parents or siblings. They read from the ledgers. They read about their own origins, their family's destruction, their engineered conception, as if they were crops or livestock. And after each reading, they simply looked at him, their faces neutral, allowing him, for the first time in his life, to see them as people rather than property. One visitor was a young man named Benjamin, 22 years old, born from a parent between a woman from Rutledge's plantation and a man from Crenshaw's estate. Benjamin's mother had died in childbirth during her fourth forced pregnancy. His father had been sold to a Louisiana plantation when Benjamin was 6 to prevent attachment that might make him less compliant. Benjamin read these facts aloud in a steady voice. Then he asked Rutledge one single question. "Can you remember what my mother looked like?" Rutledge couldn't. He remembered her ledger designation: productive female, strong constitution, good temperament. But he could not recall her face, her voice, anything that would identify her as a human being. This realization haunted him more than anything else during his captivity. The third and fourth days brought more visitors, each with their own ledger entries, each representing a life reduced to data points in Rutledge's meticulous system. A woman named Margaret, separated from her 3 children, each sold to a different plantation to prevent unproductive emotional attachments. A man named Joshua, bred specifically for physical strength, paired 5 times with different women, his children scattered across 3 states, none of whom he was ever allowed to know or raise. By the 5th day, Rutledge was no longer reading the ledgers. He was writing. Someone had provided fresh paper and ink, and he found himself compulsively documenting his own experience using the same clinical language he had once used to describe enslaved people. Subject exhibits significant psychological distress, appetite diminished, sleep disrupted by recurring thoughts of documented subjects. Recommendation: continued exposure to consequences of systematic dehumanization. This self-documentation, later found among the papers surrounding him, revealed the depth of his collapse. He was applying his own system to himself, trying to process guilt and horror through the only framework he understood, reducing human experience to data and analysis. On the 6th day came the final visitor, a woman in her 60s, who introduced herself only as Hannah. She had been enslaved on Rutledge's plantation when he first inherited it in 1823. One of the earliest women entered into the breeding program. She had borne 6 children over 15 years. All 6 were sold away as soon as they were profitable. She was free now. Crenshaw had freed his enslaved people after his own captivity, and she had come to tell Rutledge something he needed to hear. "I don't hate you," she said, her voice carrying decades of weight. "Hate would require me to see you as something worth hating. What you need to understand, Mr. Rutledge, is that for 20 years, you didn't see us. We were right in front of you, and you looked through us like we were furniture." She leaned closer. "Moses didn't create something new when all this happened to you and the others. He simply made you feel what it's like to be seen the way you saw us, as functions, as tools, as things that exist for someone else's purpose." Then she placed a final document on the desk, a list of names. Every person born from the consortium's breeding program, with their current locations, their families if they'd managed to form any, and their fates if they had died. The list was 47 pages long, more than 300 names. "These are people," Hannah said, "every single one. They have favorite foods and songs that make them cry, and dreams they'll never reach because you made sure of that. Moses wanted you to know their names, all of them, by memory if you can, but at least by reading them out loud. That was his instruction." Rutledge spent his final hours of captivity reading the list aloud, his voice breaking over and over, tears falling onto the pages. When the sheriff found him 6 days after he vanished, Rutledge was on page 39, exhausted, shaking, but still reading names into the empty room. The discovery of Rutledge threw the remaining consortium members and the local authorities into crisis. The evidence of what had been done during these captivities, the forced confrontation with their own practices, was undeniable, but prosecuting anyone for it presented an impossible challenge. What crime had been committed? The owners had been temporarily detained, yes, but they had been fed, sheltered, and physically unharmed. They had been shown documents, their own documents, and had received visits from people who simply read information aloud and asked questions. Moreover, the level of sophistication required to orchestrate these reversals implied a degree of organization among enslaved people that the white community was unwilling to acknowledge publicly. To prosecute anyone would mean admitting that enslaved people were capable of complex planning, capable of maintaining absolute secrecy across multiple plantations, capable of outwitting their masters so thoroughly that no evidence of conspiracy could be found. Such an admission would shatter the entire ideological foundation of slavery. 5 days after Rutledge was found, Thaddeus Beaumont disappeared. His captivity lasted only 4 days, but those 4 days were reportedly the most intense of all the reversals. Beaumont had always been a consortium member most fervent about what he called the scientific approach to breeding. He pushed for more detailed record-keeping, more systematic pairings based on physical and mental characteristics, and more aggressive separation of families to prevent emotional entanglements. When Beaumont was found chained inside an abandoned tobacco bar at the edge of his own property, he wasn't surrounded by documents. He was surrounded by tools, the whips, chains, and branding irons used to enforce discipline on the plantations. These tools had not been used on him. They were simply arranged around him, alongside ledgers documenting every punishment inflicted on enslaved people across the 9 plantations over 2 decades. The implication was unmistakable. Here are the instruments of control you relied on, and here's a record of how you used them. Beaumont's visitors during captivity included people who bore the scars of those very tools. They showed him healed whip marks, brands that labeled him as property, missing fingers from accidents that had actually been punishments. They didn't accuse him. They didn't shout or curse. They simply showed him what the system had cost in human flesh and asked him to calculate whether the profits had been worth it. That question broke him. Beaumont had always justified the consortium's practices through economic logic. Slavery was necessary for regional prosperity. The breeding program was essential for maintaining labor forces. Discipline was required for efficiency. But when confronted with the actual human cost, itemized and displayed before him, his neat equations collapsed. He could calculate profit margins and crop yields with perfect precision, but he had never learned to calculate the value of a person's dignity, a child's need for a parent, a woman's right to control her own body. After his release, Beaumont began the process of freeing his enslaved people, though he did so more methodically than Rutledge. He sold off portions of his land to finance their transition to freedom, negotiated work contracts that gave them equity in the plantation production, and established a fund to help relocated families reconnect with relatives who had been sold away. His transformation was slower than Rutledge's dramatic collapse, but ultimately more practical. By 1847, everyone who had been enslaved on his plantation was legally free, and several had become landowners themselves through Beaumont-sponsored purchases. The aftermath of the reversal spread like ripples across the Yazoo Delta and beyond. The immediate effect was a complete dissolution of consortium. By summer 1844, the quarterly meetings had ended. The breeding program was formally abolished, and the once tight coordination among the 9 plantations fractured into isolated, desperate attempts to maintain profitability without the systematic exploitation that had sustained them. But the deeper consequences took years to surface. The 9 owners, each transformed in different ways, reshaped the region's approach to slavery. Some responses were admirable, Others were purely pragmatic, but none of them could return to the casual brutality that had defined their operations. Bartholomew Crenshaw, the first to be taken, never recovered his psychological balance. His wife, Mary, later wrote in a private journal, discovered decades afterward, that her husband woke most nights in a cold sweat, muttering about schedules and rotations. He became obsessed with locating the children born under his plantation's breeding program, spending vast sums to buy their freedom from wherever they had been sold. By the time of his death in 1851, he had freed or purchased the freedom of 63 people directly connected to his former operations. Other slaveholders considered him mad. Those he freed saw a man desperate for redemption he could never truly obtain. Josiah Pryor took a different path. Forced during captivity to read about the families he had deliberately separated, he became an advocate for what he called ameliorated slavery, a gradual reform system meant to phase out the institution entirely. He wrote letters to newspapers, spoke at civic meetings, and proposed legislation to limit the separation of families and require education for enslaved children. His ideas were too radical for Mississippi in the 1840s. He eventually moved to Maryland, where moderate reform movements had more support. His efforts achieved little immediate success, but his writings later influenced abolitionists, who pointed to a former slave owner acknowledging the system's fundamental cruelty. Nathaniel Pendergast responded with denial and deflection. He freed a token number of enslaved people, just enough to claim moral awakening, but maintained his labor force through increasingly elaborate legal strategies that amounted to slavery in all but name. He rented enslaved people from others, paid minimal wages while charging inflated prices for food and housing, and created debt arrangements that trapped nominally free black workers in permanent servitude. He died in 1859, still wealthy, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. His reforms merely cosmetic measures to avoid ever facing what the reversals had shown him. Cyrus Whitfield abandoned plantation ownership entirely. Within months of his captivity, he sold his land and enslaved people, profiting one final time from human trafficking, and moved to New Orleans, where he invested in shipping and banking. He never spoke publicly about what happened to him during those days of captivity, but his business papers reveal an obsessive avoidance of any venture connected to plantation agriculture. He became wealthy again through entirely different means, perhaps believing that distance and new industries could cleanse him of his past. His former enslaved people, sold in bulk to a Louisiana planter notorious for brutality, likely viewed his departure as one final betrayal. Augustus Fairchild, the man who had first suggested dissolving the consortium, struggled with turning his awakening into action. He wanted to free his enslaved people, but feared the financial ruin it would bring to his family. His solution was a gradual emancipation plan that freed people in cohorts over 5 years, with each freed individual receiving a small plot car from his property. By 1849, everyone was legally free, though many remained as paid laborers, not out of loyalty, but because the economic realities of the antebellum South offered them few alternatives. Fairchild died in 1856, still paying off debts from his gradual emancipation. His obituary described him both as a man of conscience and a cautionary tale of impractical philanthropy. Cornelius Vance's response was perhaps the most coldly calculated. He freed his enslaved people in 1844, but structured their freedom through contracts that essentially indentured them to his plantation for 7 years, with wages to be paid only at the conclusion of the contract. Most of his freed people, lacking resources and facing strict legal restrictions on their movement as free black residents of Mississippi, had no choice but to sign. Vance maintained full plantation productivity while technically fulfilling his moral obligation, proving how easily the language of freedom could be twisted to preserve exploitation. When the 7-year contracts expired in 1851, many discovered that the promised wages had been consumed by carefully engineered debts for housing and food. Vance considered this good business. His former enslaved people considered it proof that legal freedom meant nothing without economic power. Edmund Halsey took the most radical path. After his captivity, he embraced immediate abolitionism, freeing all enslaved people on his plantation without conditions and dedicating the rest of his financial resources to helping them relocate to free states. He sold his plantation for a fraction of its value to fund transportation and settlement for more than 90 people. By 1846, he was bankrupt, living in a modest house in Vicksburg, working as a clerk, a job typically held by men with neither property nor prospects. His peers shunned him. His family was humiliated. But letters from those he freed, sent from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, expressed a gratitude that seemed to sustain him. He died in 1862, poor but at peace, one of the very few former slaveholders who chose complete rather than convenient redemption. Silas Rutledge's response was the most dramatic and in many ways the most devastating to his former status. His immediate freeing of all the enslaved people on his plantation in March 1844 shocked the region. His subsequent effort to track down and purchase the freedom of people who had been sold away from his plantation bankrupted him entirely. His wife, unable to accept the social and financial ruin, left him and returned to her family in Charleston with their children. But Rutledge went further. In 1845, he began testifying in legal proceedings, as a witness in cases involving enslaved people, as an expert in cases concerning plantation practices, and as a reluctant but powerful source for abolitionists documenting the mechanics of slavery. His testimony was devastating precisely because he held nothing back, describing in clinical detail the operations of the breeding program, the deliberate fracturing of families, the calculated dehumanization required to keep the system functioning. These testimonies made him a pariah. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Threatening letters arrived. Someone burned down the small home he had moved into after selling his plantation. But Rutledge seemed driven by something beyond fear or shame, a need to expose what he had spent 20 years building, as if public confession might accomplish what private guilt could not. In 1847, Rutledge published an extraordinary document, a full accounting of his plantation's breeding program from 1823 to 1844, including the financial calculations showing the profits generated from forced reproduction. He did not publish it to defend or justify himself. He published it to condemn the system. He demonstrated, with cold precision, that his wealth, the wealth that made him respectable and influential, had been built directly on systematic rape and the destruction of families. Mississippi authorities seized and burned the document as inflammatory and dangerous to public order. But copies had already been sent north, where abolitionists circulated it widely as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. Thaddeus Beaumont's more measured approach produced different results. His systematic transition of his enslaved people to freedom, combined with financial support for family reunification, became a model used by moderate reformers as proof that emancipation could be gradual, structured, and economically viable. Beaumont himself never advocated abolition beyond his own plantation, but his example, however limited, however motivated by guilt rather than principle, demonstrated that ending the breeding program and freeing enslaved people did not necessarily lead to financial collapse. The 9 plantations, once the most profitable in the region, met varied fates. Some were sold and subdivided. Others limped along with drastically reduced labor forces. A few found new owners who, unaware or unconcerned with consortium's dark history, attempted to restore traditional plantation operations. But the breeding program itself never returned in the Yazoo Delta. Other plantation owners, hearing whispered accounts of what had happened to consortium, became more cautious, less systematic, more aware that their enslaved people might be watching, remembering, planning. This diffusion of fear, the recognition that enslaved people were not passive property, but potential agents of sophisticated resistance, may have been Moses Jackson's most significant long-term achievement. He had demonstrated that the system's weaknesses were exploitable, that intelligence and patience could accomplish what violence could not, that those who had been systematically dehumanized could prove themselves more strategically capable than their oppressors. Moses Jackson himself remained on what had once been Rutledge's plantation through the summer of 1844, a curious position, given that he had been freed. He organized a transition, helping the newly freed people navigate the complicated legal and economic realities of freedom in a slave state. He negotiated work contracts with nearby landowners who still needed labor. He established a school in one of the former slave cabins, teaching literacy and basic mathematics to children and adults who had been deliberately kept ignorant. He created networks to help people locate family members who had been sold away, using his knowledge of the consortium's records to trace where individuals had been sent. This organizing work was perhaps even more remarkable than the reversals themselves. Moses could have left immediately after gaining freedom, fled north like countless enslaved people who escaped bondage. Instead, he chose to stay for months in the very region where he could be re-enslaved if legal technicalities were challenged, and where his life was in danger by those who suspected his role in consortium's collapse. He stayed because the reversals had never been about personal revenge. They had been about creating space for something new, and that required more than simply breaking the old system. Rachel worked beside him during these months, organizing the women who had suffered most directly under the breeding program. She helped them understand that freedom meant reclaiming authority over their own bodies and their own reproductive choices. She taught them about herbal contraceptives and abortifacients that could finally give them control plantation owners had denied. She helped arrange marriages, real marriages, with legal standing where possible, or at least ceremonies recognized by the community, allowing couples to formalize relationships that slavery had rendered unstable or meaningless. Together, Moses and Rachel created what might be understood as a prototype for Reconstruction before Reconstruction existed, a systematic attempt to help formerly enslaved people transition from being property to being free, addressing not just legal status, but the practical, psychological, and economic challenges that freedom required. They weren't entirely successful. The obstacles were immense: limited resources, overwhelming hostility from surrounding white communities, and the crushing weight of generational trauma. But they tried, and some of what they built lasted. In July 1844, Moses and Rachel finally left Mississippi. Historical records indicate they reached Ohio by late August, settling near Cincinnati in a community established by free black people and formerly enslaved individuals who had escaped or purchased their freedom. The community had the infrastructure to support newcomers: churches offering aid, schools for children and adults, craftspeople who trained apprentices, and a shared understanding that freedom in the North was precarious and could only be preserved through collective support. Moses found work as a clerk at a black-owned shipping company, his literacy and meticulous handwriting finally serving purposes that built rather than documented oppression. Rachel worked as a seamstress and eventually opened a small shop. They purchased a modest home in 1847, actual property ownership, something impossible for them in Mississippi. They had 4 children: Esther, named for Moses' mother, Frederick, Hannah, and James. Census records show that all 4 attended school, several into secondary education, an achievement that would have been punishable by law in the state where their parents had been enslaved. Moses lived until 1879, dying at 56 from pneumonia during a harsh winter. His obituary in the Cincinnati Colored Citizen was brief and understated. A respected member of the community and devoted family man, survived by his wife Rachel for children and 12 grandchildren. Services at Bethel AME Church. There was no mention of Mississippi, no mention of what he had done there, no acknowledgement of the systematic reversal that dismantled a breeding program and transformed 9 men's lives. The silence was almost certainly intentional, even in the North, even after the Civil War. Openly discussing slave resistance could attract unwanted attention to families who wanted only to live peacefully. Yet within the black community in Cincinnati and beyond, Moses Jackson's story endured. It circulated in fragments, often disguised as fiction or attributed to unnamed sources. It survived in church basements, in family gatherings, in whispered conversations among people who understood what it meant for someone like them to have orchestrated resistance on such a scale. The story changed in the telling, accumulating embellishments and merging with other tales of resistance. But the core remained. A slave had used intelligence, patience, and the master's own systems to make them feel what they had inflicted on others. The impact rippled through generations in unexpected ways. Some of the children born from the consortium's breeding program, freed by Crenshaw, Rutledge, or Beaumont, eventually moved north themselves. A few reached Cincinnati, where they met Moses and Rachel, forming a small community bound by shared trauma and shared survival. These connections became networks of mutual support that lasted for decades. Families helping one another in ways plantation ownership had deliberately designed to prevent. One of these connections involved Moses' half-sister Clara, the same young woman who had read her own ledger entries to Rutledge during his captivity. Clara had been freed by Crenshaw and moved to Cincinnati in 1846, where Moses helped her find work and housing. She eventually married a carpenter named Isaiah Foster, and they had 3 children. One of those children, a daughter named Margaret, became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved children to the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. Margaret Foster's diaries, preserved by her descendants, include a brief note about her uncle Moses, a quiet man who carried great weight behind his eyes, who taught us that intelligence could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Back in Mississippi, the consortium collapse had lasting effects that stretched far beyond the 9 plantations. The breeding program's systematic approach had been unusual even among slaveholders, but its existence had normalized certain practices, detailed record-keeping, clinical language to describe human reproduction, coordinated breeding schedules between plantations. After the reversals, these practices became less common, or at least far less openly discussed. Plantation owners grew more cautious, more aware that their ledgers could be used against them, more conscious that enslaved people were paying attention in ways they had once dismissed as impossible. This shift, small as it might seem, represented a crack in the psychological foundation of slavery. The institution had always depended on the fiction that enslaved people were content with their condition, that they lacked the intellectual capacity for complex thought or coordinated planning, that they accepted their bondage as natural and inevitable. Moses Jackson and those who worked with him shattered that fiction so completely that even slaveholders who desperately wanted to believe it found themselves hesitating, second-guessing, looking over their shoulders. The broader historical impact is difficult to measure. The reversals weren't a rebellion that sparked immediate emancipation. They didn't ignite widespread uprisings. They directly affected only 9 men and their immediate circle, a fraction of the slaveholding population. But the story spread through underground networks, passed from plantation to plantation, carried in whispers, fragments, and coded messages. Enslaved people across the South drew hope and strategy from it. It proved that resistance did not require violence or martyrdom, that intelligence and patience could achieve systematic change, that the master's own tools could be turned against him. Some historians argue that the Mississippi reversals influenced later resistance strategies, the way enslaved people used literacy as a weapon, the careful documentation forcing oppressors to confront their own actions, the psychological rather than physical nature of the confrontation. These elements resurfaced in other contexts as the antebellum period progressed. Whether Moses Jackson directly inspired these later efforts or whether he tapped into strategies already emerging across the enslaved community remains unclear. What is certain is that he proved such strategies could work, could break parts of the system, not just help individuals escape it. The Confederate period and the Civil War eventually overshadowed these individual stories. When Union forces moved through Mississippi in 1863, some former consortium plantations were occupied, their lands briefly redistributed to formerly enslaved people, though most of those redistributions were later reversed during Reconstruction's betrayal. The records of the breeding program, already fragmentary and deliberately obscured, became even more scattered during the war's chaos. Some were destroyed by families ashamed of their participation. Others were lost in fires or simply misplaced in the upheaval. But some documents survived. They resurfaced decades later in attics, estate sales, historical society donations, and academic archives. Researchers piecing together Mississippi's slavery history found fragments, ledgers with clinical breeding records, personal letters describing the mysterious disappearances, testimony from legal proceedings where consortium members were forced to explain their actions. Assembled slowly throughout the 20th century, these fragments confirm the essential truth of stories preserved in black families but dismissed by white historians as exaggerations or inventions. One especially revealing discovery came in 1934, when a researcher found Silas Rutledge's personal diary among the papers of his estranged wife's family. The diary, kept sporadically between 1844 and his death in 1852, revealed his ongoing psychological torment. Entries described nightmares in which he was chained to his desk while names from the ledgers were read aloud endlessly. He wrote about the faces of people he had once owned, unsure whether they were real or imagined by guilt. He questioned everything he had once believed: racial hierarchy, the naturalness of slavery, his own moral standing. The final entry, dated March 12, 1852, 2 weeks before his death from heart failure, reads simply, "I understand now why Hannah said she did not hate me. Hatred would require her to see me as fully human. I made myself into something less than that, a function, a mechanism, a thing that processed other people into property. Moses did not need to destroy me. I had already reduced myself to machinery. He simply held up a mirror so I could finally see what I had become." This admission that the punishment was making him see himself clearly captured the essence of what Moses Jackson orchestrated. Not revenge in conventional sense, but revelation. Not violence, but visibility. Not destruction, but recognition. This story reminds us that sometimes the darkest chapters of history are not about supernatural horrors, but about humans confronting the systems they created and humanity they denied. The story of Moses Jackson asks us to consider, what does justice look like when the law itself is unjust? What does resistance look like when violence would mean suicide? And can forcing oppressors to feel their victims' experiences ever count as true accountability? What do you think of this story? Could you imagine maintaining that level of patience and planning under such conditions? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in those Mississippi plantations? The names of collaborators, details of the network, methods never recorded? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history. See you in the next video.